It's now called Pogroms and Imposture, the Violent Self-Formation of Ukrainian Warlords, 1917 to 1922.
Great, thank you.
I think Thomas gave an excellent overview and characterization of the activity and nature of the Ottoman bands. And I wanted to pick up on an area which he touched on and started talking about, namely the role of ideology in the activity of the Ottomani. As he said, the only Western historian to have published a monograph so far on the topic, Felix Schnell, examines the Ottomani as an example of group militancy within a space of violence. Now, this is a term from the German New Sociology of Violence, which sees violence, a violent space, as an area where the best way to pursue one's interests has become violence. Violence is contagious because the threat of violence forces other people to use violence themselves. And within this space, militant communities emerge in order to give their members the best chances to survive and prosper. And these Ottoman bands were examples of those militant communities. For Schnell, ideology is unimportant in the space of violence. It's merely a means of justifying the violence after the fact. Now, I think this approach has a number of pros. Namely, it leads us to have a more critical view of ideology. I don't think the Ottoman bands were fighting for a clearly defined set ideology. And the cycle of violence he describes undoubtedly existed. But as a historian, the major drawback of this approach is that it ignores the sources created by the Ottomani themselves during their activity, namely the leaflets, the newspapers, the brochures which they published and in which they stated very strange and sometimes contradictory political goals, but nevertheless they stated them in these leaflets, which led me to think about how I could accept many of the conclusions of the space of violence model, above all the situational basis of allegiances, and still use the leaflets and so on as a source. And the solution came to me from Sheila Fitzpatrick, who writes in a book on tearing off the masks that, quote, successful revolutions tear off masks, that is, they invalidate the conventions of self-presentation and social interaction that obtained in pre-revolutionary society. In such upheavals, people have to reinvent themselves to create or find within themselves personae that fit the new post-revolutionary society, end quote. And then she goes on to say, all, quote, all identity projects require impersonation. At a certain point, or in certain circumstances, impersonation becomes imposture. Now, you certainly see this creation of identity and impersonation among the Ottomani. The term Ottoman itself, of course, is the word for a leader of the Zaporozhian Cossacks, these early modern warriors who many nationalist historians saw as their forebears. And they adopted new identities by, for example, taking on nom de guerre, many of which recalled the names of either historical or folkloric leaders of the Cossacks. The picture, could I have the picture back? And and we see it slightly in the picture of Zeleny, but you also see it in, especially in pictures of Yuchim Boshko. They created their own Cossack uniforms with baggy trousers, broad belts, and often with Cossack hairstyles. I don't actually have them here, but many of Boshko's followers had the closely shaven head with long hair at the top. And Thomas was talking about photos with guns. Boshko photos himself only with a sword, a long saber, and he looks and a long dagger in his belt. So he looks very much like an early modern Cossack. But many of these personae are not just chosen, but also forced upon the insurgents by circumstances. Now, I found lots of examples of this in the memoirs of an insurgent called Underdog Vladimirov, who was a Russian-speaking landowner and former Tsarist officer who joined the insurgents in Kiev province. He adopts numerous personae throughout his career, first dressing himself as a private soldier in order to return home from the front, and then during the first Bolshevik occupation of the Kiev province, he joins a revolutionary troop in order to escape persecution from the authorities as a landowner, and he also writes poems in the revolutionary spirit, he says. So in a sense, he's acting both on and off the stage. During the German occupation of Ukraine, he's forced to adopt a new persona, namely that of a partisan, when the local peasants force him to join their band. And in the second Bolshevik occupation of Ukraine, he's now given a new persona by the peasants, this time a partisan leader, who say, you must join our band and you must lead us. Now, imposture is an essential part of his partisan activity. He and his band attach red stars to their to their clothes in order to infiltrate Bolshevik villages, work out who the Bolsheviks are, and kill them. But also the leaflets he uses at the time are a form of imposture. So this former monarchist, or this self-proclaimed monarchist, issues a leaflet saying, quote, "We are fighting not against Soviet power, but against the communists, Bolsheviks, and Jewish commissars and Chekists. Our slogan is long live the Soviets, but without communists and Bolsheviks," end quote. So, and he explains in his memoirs that this is a slogan adopted specifically to meet the peasant understanding of what Soviet power was. So he's consciously using ideas with an instrumental purpose to mobilize support. That doesn't mean that ideology is important. It shows that the actors themselves thought ideology was important because they use it. He may have been unsuccessful, but he still considered it to be important. And I suggest that we look at the more nationally conscious Otomani in a similar way and look at their slogans and leaflets with the same means. So Thomas mentioned Yurko Tunick, who was a Ottoman who fought first for the well-known warlord Otaman Hudahoriev, and as such fought on the side of the Red Army and then rose up against the Bolsheviks. He fought or entered into a temporary alliance with the left wing of the Social Democratic Party, who tried to create a non-Bolshevik, non-UNR Ukrainian Soviet state in Kiev province. And then he joins the UNR, fights for them for several years, and in 1923, he is tricked into returning to Soviet Ukraine by a Soviet security operation. Now, throughout this entire period, he's issuing leaflets presenting different personae in order to explain and justify his changing allegiances. So he starts off describing himself as a leftist Ukrainian alternative to the pseudo-socialist Russian Bolsheviks. And then he presents himself as a disciplined and determined supporter of the Ukrainian state. And finally, after 1923, when he's been tricked back into returning, he portrays himself as a repentant opponent to the Bolsheviks, who's come to see that the Bolsheviks have made concessions in the nationality question. Now, some of those positions are obviously impostures, especially the last one. We know from his private writings that he still saw the Bolsheviks as a foreign occupier of Ukraine. But others we can't really be sure whether there's genuine or, identities, or if he's just these are just impostures in order to justify his actions. And for me, it's not really an important question. The important thing is why he chose those identities at those times. And I think what we see with Tunick is the way that many warlords moved from the idea that the best way to mobilize the peasants was through social goals to national ones, which in the historiography would say, well, that's entirely wrong because the peasants were only interested in social goals. But this seems to be the movement that many Ottomani made over 1919, 1920. Now, for me, these personae are related to violence because they involved, during the time of war, the identification of who the enemy was. And as Thomas says, it was normally the Jews. And how the Jews are depicted within the personae changes as well. So when the warlords or Ottomani are presenting themselves as left-wing opponents of the Bolsheviks, the Jews are the perverters of Soviet power. Everything would be great with the Soviets if only the Jews weren't in them. And when they move to a more nationalist position, the Jews become just the eternal supporters of Russian occupation in Ukraine. So my argument is that you can accept many of the conclusions of the space of violence model, but you can still use these sources as a way of getting an understanding of what the Ottomani are doing. There's much more to the space of violence than just violence. There are other things happening in it as well, and one of them is the self-creation, the self-formation of identities.